Yes. Yes, thank you for this very rich paper, and I'm fully in agreement with you that biopolitics is not a modern invention. One have only to look at the constitution of Sparta, of Athens. Karl Popper mentioned that in the past, but where I have some problems following your argument. So in the conclusions, I agree with this, with that conclusion, but I don't agree with the way you reach those. I don't see any emphasis on thanatopolitics in the history of Western political thought. Take, for example, the centrality of the term arche, principum. Ancient Greek, Latin was the beginnings. They were concerned about the new foundations, how you create republics. They use the term genesis, as you mentioned all the time. And the pre-Socratics, I think, made a very good case about the dialectical relation between birth and death, because as they say, whatever has no beginning has no end, and it's divine. What has a beginning has always an end. What has a birth has always a death. And that was the idea of mortality, that mortality is not only oriented toward death, but is also part, it includes a beginning, a founding moment. And this continues in modernity with late medieval times with Marsilius de Padova. He describes the birth of new republics with the metaphor of giving birth of animals. How animals give in birth, they say this is how it continues with the theory of the constituent power, beginnings, giving birth. So I think this way of thinking that maybe philosophy things are different, but in politics and political theory, there was always a dialectical relationship with birth and death. I don't see any other emphasis. Also, the issue about politics, that's a very interesting thought, but I don't see why ta politica is not, cannot be translated in the modern politics. It's a plural form, it has the same grammatical and syntactic structure, so I don't see why politics is not a translation of ta politica. And especially when you said that there is a difference between politics as a knowledge and politics as an activity. Actually, Aristotle says explicitly that politics is the knowledge of an activity that he calls praxis. So when we take into account that praxis is the object of politics, then I don't see this difference between a break between a discourse that emphasizes knowledge and a discourse that emphasizes the object of that knowledge. And the last point that probably you might be in agreement with me, but maybe you mentioned, but I didn't pay attention. It is time to make it clear that the ancients didn't have the distinction between zoe and bios. This is a mythical, not to say, but scholarship. Again, Aristotle uses many times the term politikos bios. What that will be? So I would have wished if you could also attack this idea a little bit more rather than the idea of birth and death. But otherwise, I agree fully that biopolitics is nothing more than
Okay, so I was expecting this question. First of all, let me begin with the last one. I totally agree. I think this emphasis on zoe and bios is a much later invention. I don't see it at work in Greek thinking. So I think in that respect we agree. I think actually will be interesting to see how it begins. And I mean, I can see the work that it does for Agamben, and it's actually a bad work. But you know, even. Let me say, let me put it this way. Agamben has a tendency to read ancient sources in a way that makes sense for his more general project. Even the very notion of homo sacer, if you speak with an expert on Roman law, they will tell you that it's a Agamben idea. There are not enough proofs. The point is, I still think that, for instance, the notion of homo sacer catches an important point, whereas I think that the distinction between zoe and bios is largely misleading. Also because it parallels with I mean, a series of things that simply are not there, and certainly are not there for us. So it's a mythical view of the Greek life where, you know, they could still distinguish between the two things, and we no longer can. So I'm fine with that. In terms of where, let's say, I do not agree is, first, the historical remark, I don't think ta politica translate our politics for two reasons. First, ta politica as in itself, precisely because you can apply it both to the books, right, on politics and to politics itself, as this twofold dimension of being both the knowledge and the thing itself. Whereas the notion of politics, as we tend to use it in modernity, tends to focus more on the activity itself. And secondly, ta politica denotes the whole of public life, the entire activity taking place in the polis, right? And it's something that, again, I mean, if you compare this with the notion of politics that comes out from somebody like Max Weber, where it's clear that politics denote not the entire of public life, right? Not the entire of social life, but only a specific activity within it. And I think that this is even, I try to persuade you with this last bit of the argument, this is even more striking because, you know, we tend to go back to the Greeks because we like the Greeks and we think they have invented philosophy, and largely because, you know, we rely on the Germans who propose this view. But the Greeks, in a way, we come much more from the Latin than we come from the Greeks. And the Latin, which means for 14th century, right, until the term Willem von Morbeke translated Aristotle ta politica into Latin, the Latin language did not have a word for politics. When they thought about politics, they thought about it in terms of either the res publica, the whole public thing, or in terms of the societas, so the whole of social life. Now, if you look at this in this perspective, and you consider the number of centuries, people have been thinking about politics in terms of the whole of society, it's clear that our modern understanding of politics is very limited. There's a significant semantic shrinkage, right? I mean, and well, I think you do not seem persuaded, but I think I have an argument here to make in terms of, you know, what this restriction implies. And in a way, this is I didn't explain it in the talk. My view is that precisely because the Greeks and the Romans were much more political than we are, they did not feel the need to name a specific part of their public life as being politics, as being a specific activity, precisely because they identified politics with the whole of the ta politica, or the whole of what is taking place in the societas. But, okay, we can continue the conversation about it. I think there is if you look at throughout the century, there is a significant shrinkage of the term. And finally, this bias, philosophical bias, with this tendency to privilege death over birth, with two things. First, my major argument here was about the biopolitical thinkers I mentioned, and the whole of them, they begin with Hobbes, and what I'm arguing is that they tend to conceive of the political community as something that is needed because we are faced with this possibility of death. And I think we can hardly deny that in this sense they tend to privilege death over birth as a political moment. I think it's in a way, even before being philosophical, it's a very Hobbesian moment. And it's also very linked to the fact that the notion of sovereignty, with its two sides, like the internal and the external, is linked to the world. So the experience of death, very well before being linked to the experience of birth. And finally, I think the best reply to your question is what you have said yourself. Oh, you said that these people were not talking about birth, but of course, they were always talking about birth as dialectically linked to death, right? So whenever philosophers bring birth to the fore, they immediately are, oh yes, of course we are born, because this is linked to death, we are all gonna die. Can we think about politics for a moment, forgetting about death, just focusing on the fact that we are born. Why it's so? Because the fact that we are born exposes us in the first place to the fact that we depend on others. We are here, there's a plurality of people here because we depend on others. And I think there is a tendency to focus on death because however unexpected, anguish generating, death is something that in the end you can give to yourself. You can look at it. Birth, no, it's not. I mean, maybe a human clonation will open and disclose new scenarios, but for the time being, that's not the case. I can't give birth to myself, There's somebody who is giving birth to me. And for me, it's striking that there is this constant trend among philosophers to repeat, whenever they think about birth, oh yes, birth, but because we're going to die. Can we talk about birth, forgetting for a moment that we're going to die? Why do they always have to be linked to one another? We are born means that we're going to die. Let's talk about the fact that we are born, which means that there's a plurality of us, which means that in the first place, we depend on somebody else to have been given birth to us. I'm here paraphrasing Caballero.
All right, we have several questions. Maybe we'll take a couple at a time. So, Ken, and then
as you know, I'm skeptical about whether firepower means anything at all. But the piece I want to ask you about is, it seems to me you're able to offer a genealogy of politics by making bias kind of a constant. Whereas what if one thought the bias historically, but really through modern science? I mean, it's a category that changes rapidly in the 19th and 20th century, where our views of what bias is absolutely unrecognizable even from 50 years ago. And it seems there's a lot of non-thought about that category, even already in Foucault, who's writing in a present where that's taking place, but is projecting it back, I think not very successfully, into a past. So what if we thought that, and might then give us access to something that's a switch in your paper, which is from talking about power in the state to talking about capitalism. And Foucauldians do this too. It's like, the state, power, and then suddenly let's talk about capitalism. When really thinking about biological science, technology, and capitalism, there's a whole separate history that then goes unexamined and unexplored, and that then will sort of destabilize things like talking about life. Life's not a category you can talk about in biological science. There's no way to stabilize it. And where things like, the switch from birth to death, there are other ways to think this. So from Halley onwards, this becomes a statistical thing. What you're really talking about is propensities of species being. Now these are all bracketed off and categorized in the Foucauldian tradition, but they're never taken seriously as actual knowledges that give you different ways of understanding these categories. They can no longer be philosophical categories. Yeah? So we don't have access, or we only have access to the category you want to construct around life. You should ignore the sciences of it.
So thank you. I have two ideas. First of all, I agree about the problem of the kind of apocalyptic attention to death, especially in the Heideggerian form. But I wonder if by going to birth, you are not going in an equally apocalyptic direction. And I mean specifically in regard to gender. Because the alternative to this focus on death, or at least one alternative, is basically the social democratic tradition. And what the social democratic tradition emphasized, and I would include a Freudian side to the social democratic tradition, what it emphasized was not so much birth as infancy. And it seems to me birth is the one moment when you really have men and women distinguished. Men cannot give birth, women give birth. There really is no other moment. And the whole progressive direction of social democracy was really to bring men and women together. Like we have a conference right now. It doesn't really matter who is a man or who is a woman. We have gender-neutral bathrooms and so forth. And in particular, I mean, looking at it in a more historically and anthropologically, the whole role of bringing fathers in relationship to children, which goes back to the Hebrew Bible and so forth, as opposed to, the mothers, where you do have this sort of direct moment, the moment like the moment of death, is such a humanizing, so central to the whole human experience is the paternalization and so forth. So I think that the way that you bring gender in is a problem for me. And the second point has to do with capitalism. You make the very interesting point that the empire is the predecessor to the Nazi camps, that the states, excuse me for 1 second, Andrew, the whole discourse on modern self-government and so forth, the liberal discourse, in the background is the empire. They're doing things in Africa that they would never think of doing in England and so forth, and then the Nazis do it in England, or in Europe rather. And it seems to me that this is really a deep and important point, and I don't really understand the point, because you have a kind of rationality to the early plantation systems and so forth, where they are, it is rational in the sense that they are organizing capital accumulation processes, world trade, becoming wealthy off it, and so forth. And the Nazi project ultimately was truly irrational in the sense that it even went against their war. They were trying to organize the European economy, but it went against their war aims. But I don't really know what the second, I'm not sure how to develop my second point, but I do think that that link is very interesting.
Okay, shall I respond?
Sure.
Okay, so briefly, okay, they're great questions, so and it's hard to do justice to them briefly on top of it. Okay, so let me try to see what I can do. First, the bio question. You're totally right. I mean, I didn't focus very much on the historical dimension of the bio, but of course, the very notion of bio itself, I think a hint to this was in the conversation with Andreas. What is bio? Is it bare life? Is it is it qualified life? What kind of life? Is very much historically determined and changing in the different contexts. I didn't focus on that because you can't do everything in one single paper. Actually, I think if anything in this paper there is already too much in terms of material I bring to the fore. With regard to Foucault, I'm not so sure. I'm not a Foucauldian expert, but I'm not so sure we can say that is not so fully aware of the link between capitalism and biopolitics. I mean, I'm not sure I totally agree with you on that. I think that particularly what comes out of the lectures is really a link between the two. So at least what is problematic in my view is Foucault's idea, which I think is really kind of male fantasy, that at some point there was the classical age where power was purely the power of the sword, which, I mean, if you look at this from the point of view of women, women never had the power of the sword, so they were excluded from the military, but most of all, the power, the way in which their power was exercised on their body was never that classical age. So I think for me that's what most problematic in Foucault. And Eli, okay, the way I bring gender in is very complicated. I've tried to formulate expressions such as body, saying that, I'm talking about women, that is, bodies who at the time I'm talking about were the only one capable of bearing life. I don't want to go, if the question is where are you going, I don't want to go into the mysticism of maternity, women equals their capacity to bear life. I think that's, for me, it's an essentializing move, it's a no-go. I'm just talking about bodies in terms of the function they can perform, right? If things will evolve in such a way that it's no longer only women that can bear life, and fine, let's talk about bodies that can bear life and bodies that cannot bear life, right? So, and associate the notion of gender with this different capacity. I'm saying this because there is I'm here in this paper obviously trying to combine feminism with biopolitical thinker, but I don't want to go into there's a direction of feminism, kind of essentialist reading that links womanhood to maternity, and that's not a road I want to go. I mean, that would be, I think, equally unidimensional. And so I'm trying to, it's a work that I'm still doing, but I'm trying to conceptualize gender in terms of functions that body can perform, right? So bodies can be differently gendered and having different capacity, but it's a fact that at some point in history, Machiavelli is writing, the bodies that could bear life was called the body of women, right? So I'm still working on this, I'll keep working, but that's the direction I would like to take. And finally, on capitalism, the link between biopolitics and empire, and particularly Nazism and the experience of colonialism. This is not me, and there's nothing new. It's Bembe, post-colonial reading. I think there's something to it. I mean, there is some. If we begin, as it does, that's open to discussion, with the idea that sovereignty is the faculty to decide, implies the faculty to decide who can live and who has to die. There's a point in saying that sovereignty is inseparable from, at least the way in which it emerged, from a certain kind of racism, and he brings this to its extreme consequence and say that actually the technique of terror used by Nazis in concentration camps were, to a large extent, already
jumbled in.
Well, you know, I don't know whether, I'm not an historian, I don't have the material to, and also the knowledge to assess the theory, but I simply mentioned because in my view it's interesting that he reads Foucault and Agamben in this clearly thanatopolitical way. I mean, that's the only way he thinks the notion of sovereignty, as it comes out of the thinker, can be elaborated.
All right. Nancy and
So this was a really rich and interesting talk, and I've got a lot of ideas about it, which are probably not that coherent, but let me just mention two or three. One is that part of what you seem to be doing in posing this question of why the category of the biopolitical today is so has such resonance and ubiquity, the idea that somehow we need to enlarge the concept of the political, as if the sort of semantic fields of the available categories are shifting because the phenomena are shifting. And I'm not an expert on the ancient world, but it seems to me that even in Greece, you have the contrast between the polis and the oikos, and that they're somehow co-defined in terms of one another as not the other, and this clearly undergoes very important changes. People have mentioned capitalism. So, I mean, you spoke about the split between two powers, the secular and the churchly. That's important. But I think for thinking, I mean, this question of the family or kinship is so important for what you're trying to do, and the history of the political in opposition or in relation to the family and kinship is one story, and the other is the economy. And that's where capitalism comes in, where now we get the split between the political and the economic. And so that's sort of one set of ideas here, I think has to be much more part of the story. And then sort of jumping forward to Eli's idea, I mean, probably the prehistory of the biopolitical as a modern, late 20th or 21st century concept is the shift first from liberalism to social democracy and now to neoliberalism. And what that means in terms precisely of taking of having public and often state responsibility for forms of social provision, social reproduction that in earlier times were either thought of as internal to the family or in some aspects, at least in the market. And that seems to be really important here. Now, I would tell the story, I think what's good about Foucault is he has a dark side. He is the theorist of, even though it's ending as he's writing, he is the theorist of the, the bureaucratic welfare state, basically, and all the forms of discipline and blah, blah, blah within it. And he's trying to bring out the dark side of that, which we social democrats think, oh, this is great progress. And I think the Nazi thing is part of it too, actually, because I think that the social democratic state has always been concerned with pronatalism and the right colored kinds of babies and so on and so forth. And that's, so even though the Nazi thing is, the perversion of it at one level, it's not wholly, unconnected. And then finally, why the biopolitical in the neoliberal moment, when the pressure is precisely to retrench social provision for all of this. And one thing about the biopolitical, as I understand it, is that it's not political at all. It's about administrative control. It's not about politics. It's about INGOs running refugee camps that don't have any political life at all, or about vaccination campaigns and all of this stuff. It's about people being treated as bodies to be administered by a techno-health, technocratic thing, which is very good if we're talking about vaccination, after all, compared to these nuts. But the political part of it is hard to see. So I have more questions now than I had before, and I think that's progress for listening to a paper, but still.
Just to Nancy's last point before I talk about virus, I think you're right. And now I would also add, though, bodies across borders. Yes. That the immigration is about what bodies can go where.
Yeah.
And I think that's one answer to your question of why it's so acute now, is this movement and the desire to regulate it. So that might just be an added thought there. But I wanted to talk about, I want to go back to life and death. And I'm like Nancy, I think this is, you're opening up a huge set of questions about philosophy, politics, and how people have thought about this. Simone de Beauvoir completely agrees with you. She says, death is where the action is. Male culture embraces death. They can control it. Because they can kill someone, they are. That's the existential claim that they make. And that birth, anyone can do. It's just, they see it as a natural function that is not in culture. But death is in culture. She makes that distinction. And the feminists are very ambivalent about this. Because sometimes, you want to take back the body, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman made it very clear that it's not a feminist motif, and you're saying that too. You don't want to essentialize birth as some romantic special claim that we're going to make. But she said oysters can give birth. She said nothing simpler. This is not a process, a conscious process, the way deciding about war and punishment, all this. On the other hand, because in some sense men have sort of abrogated death as part of what this whole structure of control and power is, and women seem to be somewhat outside it, feminist philosophers like Riglena Nikolchina, for example, says that actually what women experience is the death of their consciousness. In other words, because they give birth and because they are who they are, that they need to be murdered. Because to become a separate person who isn't born, who isn't beholden to that other being that you're describing, you actually have to make a break, a psychological, political break between yourself and the birth. So she assigns birth as a thing that has to be forgotten. If you're going to have the aspects of the polis as we know it, where death is more important. So there's something very, talk about dark, a real struggle between the genders about which thing is going to be remembered, and how, and described. And if we don't want to go to the, birth is wonderful location, where do we go with the, and I like what you're doing. I mean, you're trying to sort of create a messy middle that's neither birth nor death, but actually has to do with people in the polis mixing it up. It's very hard to do to demythicize this material, and I honor your effort.
Chiara, if you don't mind, also want to squeeze a question, because I'm afraid there will be more time. But I want to follow up a bit on what Nancy said, namely about the idea of geneapolitics or biopolitics. Because for Aristotle, for example, it's very clear that politics is about praxis, action. Now, and he makes a very stark distinction between praxis and poiesis of production. He says that politics can never be about production. What is the difference between praxis and poiesis, or action and production? In action, the purpose of action lies within action itself, never goes out. And that's why all our life is political through and through. We are political beings, zone political, human being. But production is an activity of which the purpose lies outside of that activity. So you make something, and the product then something is outside of it. And then I think that your description of geneapolitics or biopolitics essentially follows the production paradigm. So it's not about practice, not about voice, it's about production. And there's been quite a bit of debate and criticism of that in Hannah Arendt and Heidegger and others.
Well, okay, let me begin with trying to summarize with the last question. I'm not so sure with it, because I mean, at least the way I recall the poiesis in Aristotle, poiesis is about creating something which principle is not in the agent itself, so like artistic creation, right? So the idea is that you create something ex nihilo, and I fear, going back to the gender question, that is the sort of, would be the sort of mysticism of birth as creation ex nihilo, which birth is a creation, but it's not ex nihilo, right?
It's not a sneaky linear.
It's not, but the idea is that the agent does not have, if I remember correctly, the principle in itself. Like, that's the difference between poiesis in the sense of the poetics, right, as it describes in the poetics, from the praxis or the theoresis, because the praxis and the theoresis are different in that respect. But
neither of those two categories fits. Neither poiesis nor praxis.
I would not like to go. I mean, I'm still working on this. I need to think more about it. But I really would not like to go into a totally poetic understanding of birth. And here maybe I can also try to reply to Anne's question. I think this idea that death is cultural and birth is nature and purely nature, it's part of the mysticism of, let's go back to our women maternal destiny that I want to avoid. I think that's very problematic. Let's say I realize that the space I'm trying to carve is very difficult, because on one hand, and Andreas is no longer here, but on one hand there is this tendency, I have to say, even in Arendt herself, because on one hand when she speaks about birth, she's speaking about bodies giving birth, but then she speaks about what she calls the second birth, which is the fact that you're only birth, where we are witness in words and actions. And the step from there to Socrates' idea that when we speak about birth, we want to speak about the maeutic, the birth of concept. So in the end, or Andreas was mentioning, these people were thinking about birth because they were thinking about, founding new politics. But founding new politics, when I speak about birth, I'm speaking about giving birth to a body, not to a concept, not to a new political bodies, not to a state. I'm thinking about birth as actually giving birth to another human body. And for me, it's significant that we have such a difficulty of taking this fact seriously, which is, for all the people who are in this room, there are other, an equal number of births, meaning actual birth, which have taken place. So we constantly have this tendency to shift when it comes to birth to something else, like either the second birth indeed, or the founding of political community, or the birth of the nation of which we are part. I'm trying to carve a space which is neither the mysticism of pure nature, nor the equal mysticism of the second birth, third birth, or whatever. And to reply to Nancy's question, I mean, there are lots, it's a lot of food for thought. What I would like to say is just that I think also the opposition between the oikos and the polis is a bit overstated, in the sense that, at least in my reading, both in Aristotle and in Plato, there is the idea that politics is about the needs, right? And so the relationship is, this is not to say that there is no distinction between the oikos and the polis, but what I think the model they have is a much more organic one that we have developed later on. That is, the polis is an offspring, right? It builds on the oikos in a kind of organic model. So you cannot have the polis without the oikos. Whereas when we tend to look at it in terms of the public-private distinction, we tend to think of the private as a separate sphere from the public. And I think that when we, also your questions as to why biopolitics now in the neoliberal context, one of the reasons is because the distinction between private and public is being renegotiated, and to a large extent it's collapsing. If we can no longer have the confidence that in the 18th century people had in saying the parliament can make everything but make a man a woman, if we can no longer point to supposedly natural limits to power, then we have to renegotiate also the very distinction and meaning of the separation between the private and the public.
Well, we have, I think, 3 or 4 more questions, but I'm afraid we don't have enough time for that, so I have to apologize to all those who didn't have a chance to ask a question. I hope you can talk to Chiara afterwards. I want to thank you for your very recent